was the intention. Now, some of these phone calls, I hope that everybody checked in with the office, at least those that are not, that are here without permission. I will send a couple of emails and so on. But it's time for us to start with session 2 of the conference, proudly sponsored by First Rand Namibia. Of course, 3 very equally important issues that we're going to focus on: education, improved opportunities to learn and reason. That will be the first panel discussion. That will be followed by land for production and investment with Dr. John Mendelson. And then from poverty to prosperity, we've got a Minister of Poverty Eradication that was introduced by the current president, Dr. Hage Kengop. The permanent secretary is here from the ministry, and she'll be joining us just to map out what the plans are, what's currently happening at the ministry, and of course, how they plan on eradicating poverty, or at least some of the efforts that are prioritized for this year. So without wasting any time, let me please introduce. In fact, before I introduce him, just a quick change on the program. So what we will do is, on the program, it's indicated that the discussion will be about 30 minutes. We are going to adjust that. The discussion will in fact be for about 45 minutes. About 40 minutes actually, and then we'll give you 30 minutes Q&A with the education panel. And then only after that, we'll continue with the land for production and investment, followed by from poverty to prosperity, and then we'll have the Q&A session for those 2 speakers together. The reason for that is, of course, if we have all 6 speakers on stage, I think it'll be a little bit condensed in terms of the issues that we want to tackle, so we just want to give each of them room to be able to answer your questions. So without wasting any time, let me announce and welcome the facilitator for this panel discussion. JB Skipper is an associate of the Economic Association of Namibia. A round of applause for him, please.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the introduction, Master of Ceremonies. So I would like to first introduce our first speaker on the topic of improved opportunities to learn and reason. The first speaker will be Jess Brown, and she is from UNICEF, and she is also the mean maker of a lamb tagine. I know this personally. Please give her a round of applause.
Okay, good morning. I'm here on behalf of the education team from UNICEF, and we've been working closely with the Ministry of Education over the last 5 years or so to better understand what the inequalities in education are, and then to start working towards systemic, sustainable interventions that can try and address some of these inherent inequalities. So I'm just going to do a quick presentation to give kind of an overview of what the state of inequality in education is and some of the issues, and to give a bit of a background to understand why we're seeing these patterns, and then just to mention some of the interventions that are currently happening. I think it's a nice way to start on, we give the status, which is maybe not that positive, but then to also start with a bit of a kind of positive injection about what interventions are ongoing, which we hope will see some change. So, since independence, I've just got this data now from 2004, but the trend continues backwards until from independence. We are seeing an increase in access to education, and there have been a lot of efforts made to improve access to education in Namibia. So in 2013 and 2016, respectively, primary and secondary education was made free. It's compulsory within our constitution, and there's a new education bill which will be tabled in Parliament within the coming weeks, which is very rights-based, very progressive, and tries to get rid of some of the remaining barriers to education, so that things like needing a birth certificate in order to enter school. And we have some really progressive policies in this country to try and ensure that access to education is high. So, for example, the learner pregnancy policy that encourages pregnant learners to return to school and makes it easy for them to return to school. The inclusive education policy that tries to make sure that learners with special needs or disabilities are in school and learning, HIV and AIDS policies, which are supposed to make sure that children who have HIV or AIDS are still in school and well supported, OVC and marginalized children policies, and so on. So the legislation and the policy environment is pretty good. Net enrollment rates have been a bit of a contentious issue because our population projections aren't quite right, but the net enrollment rates that we've worked out using using a sort of combination of different population projections, both from NSA and from UNDESA, show that in terms of primary education, net enrollment is good at 97.7%. Secondary education, it starts off quite high, but then the problem is we start losing kids out of the system quite rapidly, so it's only at 55.9%. We have a national problem with repetition and dropout. So we see even in grade 1, we have a 20% repetition rate, which shows you a massive problem with the education foundation, so ECD and pre-primary. If in grade 1 you're already falling behind, it means you're spending the rest of your education trying to catch up where your foundation is weak. We also see at the end of every phase, because of our promotion policy, at the end of every phase we see a big dropout. So the ones that I've circled there, you see in grade 5, grade 8, a big repetition, and then in grade 8 and grade 10 we see dropouts. So who is dropping out and falling behind? The obvious one is children from low-income brackets. So that's an obvious one. Although education is now free, there's still a lot of hidden expenses. So your transport, your food, your uniform, your stationery, things like that. We're also seeing this huge discrepancy in survival rates in schools between our urban and our rural populations. Now, this is quite alarming. These 4 categories are the remoteness categories that the Ministry of Education uses to classify their schools. Category 1 is the most remote, rural remote schools that are far from services. These are broken down by how far you are from shops, whether you have electricity, water, different things like that. So what we're seeing here is of your 100% of kids that start in grade 1, in your most remote schools, only 1% are finishing grade 12. Whereas in your urban schools, 56% are finishing grade 12. Now, part of that we need to take into account is because in our most remote schools, they often don't go all the way up to grade 12. A lot of our remote rural schools will be combined schools that maybe only go up to grade 10. So then the kids will have to move to a more urban school. But we are also just seeing these rural schools are the ones that have the fewest, the biggest distances, more kids in hostels. They often don't have water and electricity. So there are a lot of other push factors in these remote schools that are also pushing kids out of the system. We're also seeing that children from marginalized communities are falling behind. If you look at this, so this is survival rate by home language. So we can see, for example, that our San children are not remaining in school. They're dropping out even by grade 7. There's been a massive drop in children from the San communities. And also what this shows us is that if you're being taught in a language that's not your home language, you have a disadvantage. So English and Afrikaans are also associated with more sort of historical wealth. So that also shows why that could also explain why there's higher rates of survival for those languages. And we also need to bear in mind, sorry, just one thing I forgot to mention here. We need to bear in mind that also our rural and remote schools aren't attracting the best teachers. So I'll talk about that a bit later, but that's also one of the problems that we see that explains that. Children with disabilities are also missing out on education. You can see from these graphs, so these are from different census years, and we're not really seeing an improvement. In some places we're seeing higher rates of school leaving as we progress through the years. So a high number of children with disabilities never attended schools, a very small number are attending schools. And then also we need to bear in mind learner mothers. Although we have those strong policies, they're not always trickling down. Implementation continues to be a problem. So we're losing our learner mothers. If we have child-headed households, they're obviously under more pressure to leave school. Children from the lowest income brackets, children who are in employment, etc. So some other notable disparities, we have a huge difference in out-of-school children across our regions. So for example, the average of out-of-school children is 18% in the country, but if you zone in on a region like Kunene, you're looking at almost half your children are out of school. If you zone in on Omaheke, almost a third of your children are out of school. It is also notable that those two regions have high populations of marginalized communities. So you have a lot of San and Omaheke and a lot of Ovahimba in Kunene. We also see a massive difference in teacher qualifications across our region. So in Kunene, only 66.6% of the teachers are formally trained, and in Khomas, almost 90% are formally trained. So this is again talking about which regions are attracting teachers. If you've gone through your schooling and you've gone through university, maybe you're not so keen to go to a region where you feel like your opportunities aren't as good, you don't have as many access to facilities, and so on. Access to ECD, so early childhood development, which we refer, ECD here, we sort of are referring to pre-primary, but also kindergartens, and also in-home stimulation and early development of children. So only 24% of our children nationally are attending ECD centers, so your kindergartens, your play schools. In the rural areas, it's only about 20%, and with children of disabilities, 87% are not in ECD centers. And these are children that really need early motor skill development, cognitive development, so they're really missing out there. Also, we see a big disparity in our facilities in schools. So the difference between running water, for example. In Commerce, all schools have running water, but in Kavango East, only 67% of schools have running water. Similarly, if you look at that graph here, we see the difference between pit toilets and flush toilets. And then we also need to bear in mind that the state of repair of some of those toilets. If you're in Windhoek, you're closer to your Ministry of Works and Transport, perhaps you might have a better chance of having your facilities repaired than if you're in a rural and remote school in Kavango East. And then we're also seeing huge differences in performance across regions. This is just to give you a snapshot, but so for example, in Omaheke, only 27% of children are getting above a D or better in maths in grade 10, for example, versus Omosati there has 62% are achieving a D or better in maths. Bearing in mind that a D or better in maths in your grade 12 is what you need to get into university. And then in English, we're seeing even more alarming statistics. So for example, our grade 12 in Ohangwena, only 8% of those kids are getting a D or better in English, whereas in Hardap, 72%. So huge differences in quality of outcomes across the regions. And this obviously has an impact on your tertiary attainment. Something that I think is quite shocking, alarming, worth noting. So in 2017, only 39% of our grade 12 learners qualified for tertiary education. And if you think about those survival rates, think how few children are actually getting to grade 12. Of that, only about 40% qualified for tertiary. Bearing in mind that our tertiary qualifications in Namibia are fairly low, it's a D for maths and English. Some are even contemplating an E for some subjects. So that means of those children that started in grade 1 in 2006, only 11.8% left school with the ability to go to tertiary. So that already shows you those kids have had to get over a lot of struggles to get, or a lot of different hurdles to get there. So it's the more resilient, the one with the better support systems, the one that had maybe more innovative teaching. And then when we do get to tertiary, there's not very much data about the backgrounds of our tertiary students, unfortunately, but what I found was this. So we see that the huge majority of those in tertiary are in Commerce region, and that probably just speaks to the physical access. We have far more university tertiary institutions in Commerce, and they're easier to access. So, what's going on? One of the things that we found, we supported the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture to do a public expenditure review to try and understand